There's a kind of silence that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is happening, and someone decided you weren't worth the noise. That was the silence Marcus Webb walked into on a Tuesday morning in August when he pushed open the door of the recruiting office in Beaufort, South Carolina, and every Marine in the room looked at him the way people look at whether they've already decided isn't their problem. Not hostile, not curious, just absent, like he was furniture that had wandered in under its own power and would eventually wander back out. He was 22. He had a limp from a car accident at 17 that hadn't fully healed right, a high school diploma from a county that didn't graduate many, and a hunger in his chest that had no clean name. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want a parade. He wanted to be told, once by someone who meant it, that he was capable of something difficult. The Marines whispered to each other instead. One of them smirked. What happened next took 11 months, 12 men, and a level of institutional courage that most people spend their whole careers carefully avoiding. It didn't make the evening news. It didn't trend online. It lived in the kind of place where real things tend to live, in the details, in the choices made when nobody was watching, in what happens when a group of men who have already survived the unsurvivable decide to use what they learned. This is that story. Marcus Webb did not come from a military family. He came from a family that argued about the electric bill and kept a pit bull named Roosevelt who had never once in his life been aggressive toward anything except the mailbox. His father had worked 30 years at a tire distribution warehouse outside Beaufort and had the back to prove it. His mother cleaned rooms at a hotel on the highway that catered mostly to traveling salesmen and families stopping on the way to somewhere better. Marcus had grown up watching both of them work themselves to the edge of themselves every single day, and what he had taken from that watching was not despair. What he took was a very specific kind of determination that doesn't advertise itself. He was not a loud person. He was not someone who walked into rooms with his chest out or his chin up in a way that signals to other people that you've decided you matter. He walked into rooms like a person who is still figuring out whether rooms are the right place for him. He had been that way since the accident at 17, when a pickup truck ran a red light on Route 21 and put him in the hospital for 6 weeks and left him with a right knee that worked fine most of the time and then didn't suddenly and without announcement, usually when it was most inconvenient. The limp was not dramatic. It was the kind of limp that people who didn't know him wouldn't always notice, and the kind of limp that people who did know him knew not to mention. Marcus never mentioned it either. He had folded it into himself the way you fold a difficult thing that belongs to you. Not with denial, not with pride, just with the quiet acknowledgement that this is part of the inventory now. He had thought about the military since he was 19. He had a friend, Devin, who had joined the Army at 18 and come back 2 years later with a structure to him that he hadn't had before. Not stiff, organized, like someone had taken all the scattered parts of Devin and arranged them into something coherent. Marcus wanted that. Not the uniform, not the rank, not even the particular idea of serving, though that was in there too. He wanted the coherence. He wanted to be handed something genuinely hard and find out what he was made of when hard things were required. He walked into the Marine recruiting office on a Tuesday in August because the Army recruiter he had called never called back, and the Marine office was 3 blocks closer to where he'd parked. He had showered that morning. He was wearing clean clothes. He had printed his high school diploma and his work history at the distribution warehouse where he had been employed for 2 years. He had done everything a person is supposed to do when they want to be taken seriously. The room was small and fluorescent and smelled like coffee that had been sitting since early. There were 4 Marines in it, 2 at desks, 1 leaning against a filing cabinet, 1 standing near the window. They were all in their 20s except one, who was older, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of face that has decided it's done being surprised by anything. When Marcus opened the door, all 4 of them looked up. And then, in the way of people who have communicated with each other long enough to do it without words, something passed between them. It wasn't a word. It was a recalibration, a lowering of whatever attention they had briefly offered. The man at the closest desk asked him what he needed. Marcus explained. He said he was interested in enlisting. He said he had his documentation. He put his paperwork on the desk. The man at the desk looked at the paperwork the way someone looks at mail they already know isn't for them. He asked Marcus about the limp. Marcus said it was from an old injury. Mostly healed. He said he had been tested by a physical therapist 2 months ago, and the joint was functional and stable. The man at the desk said that was something they'd have to evaluate. Marcus said he understood. Then, the man near the filing cabinet said something quiet to the man near the window. And the man near the window made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not one. Marcus heard it. Marcus was supposed to hear it. That was the whole point of it. It was the kind of comment that is made at the volume of dismissal, which is just loud enough that the dismissed person understands their position without the person doing the dismissing having to own the act openly. It is a coward's instrument, and it is very effective. Marcus stood there for another 3 minutes. He was given a pamphlet. He was told someone would follow up. He thanked the man at the desk, and he walked out and got in his car and sat there for a while without starting it. He was not crushed. He had been dismissed before by teachers, by coaches, by employers who looked at the zip code on his application and made their decision before they finished reading his name. He knew dismissal. What he felt sitting in that car was something harder to name, a kind of grief for the version of the morning he had imagined, the one where someone looked at his paperwork and said, "Yeah, let's talk about this seriously." That morning had been a real thing to him, and now it wasn't, and the difference between what you imagine and what you get is a distance that has to be walked across every single time. He drove home. He told his mother the interview went fine because he did not want to explain the particular kind of fine it had been. 2 weeks later, he tried again. Different branch, different city, different recruiter. That one was more professional and less cruel, but arrived at the same conclusion through the paperwork rather than the smirking, the knee injury, the documentation gap. The way the recruiter's face did a specific thing when Marcus described the accident, a tightening around the eyes that meant a decision was being made that had nothing to do with the rest of the conversation. Marcus drove home that time without stopping. He started working out with the specificity of a man who has something to prove to no one but himself. He ran. The knee held. He ran more. He did the kind of morning routines that nobody sees because they happen at 5 a.m. in a public park with broken lights, and a dog running loose from 3 blocks over who showed up every morning like a training partner who had simply decided to commit. He tracked his times. He stretched the knee every night with the care of someone tending to something precious and damaged and worth the effort. He was doing this 3 months in when he met Raymond Okafor. Raymond was 61 years old and walked with a cane that he had decorated with small brass tacks arranged in a pattern that meant something to him and that he had never explained to anyone. He was 6 feet and change and had the physical presence of someone who had once been built like a tank and had redistributed the weight without losing any of the solidity. He sat every morning on the same bench in the same park where Marcus ran, drinking coffee from a thermos with the deliberate pleasure of a man who has earned every quiet morning he gets. Marcus had seen him for weeks before they spoke. Raymond spoke first. He said, "You're favoring that right side on the uphill." Marcus said he had an old knee injury. Raymond said he had 3. He said 2 of his were from things that had tried to kill him, and 1 was from a ladder, which was more embarrassing than both of the others combined. Marcus asked what the things that tried to kill him were. Raymond said 2 deployments and 1 very bad decision in 1987 that he had been politely asked never to discuss in the presence of anyone still employed by the government. He was a Navy SEAL, retired, had been for 18 years. He still came to the park every morning not because he needed to, but because structure was the architecture of sanity, and he had learned that the hard way and did not intend to unlearn it. They started talking, not that morning, but over mornings. The way conversations build when 2 people keep arriving at the same place, not by plan, not by design, just by the accumulation of presence. Marcus told Raymond about the recruiting office, about the whisper, about the smirk. He told it plainly, without drama, the way he told most things. Raymond listened in the way of someone who has heard a great many things and knows the difference between a story and a wound. He didn't say it was wrong. He didn't say it was right. He said, "What do you want to do about it?" Marcus said he wanted to enlist. Raymond said, "I know that. What do you want to do about what happened in that room?" And Marcus, who had not thought about it in those terms, sat with the question for long enough that the park got louder around them as the morning came on. And then he said, "I want someone to take me seriously." Raymond looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said, "let's see what we can build." What Raymond built over the next 6 weeks was a network. He had not intended to build a network. He had intended to make one phone call to an old teammate named Frank D. Silva, who was now a veterans advocacy coordinator in Charleston, and asked him if he knew anyone who worked with enlistment cases involving physical documentation. That was the plan. One call. 2 people. Frank D. Silva had other ideas. Frank called a man named Garrett Hooks, who had been a SEAL with Frank in 2002 and was now doing civilian disability assessment consulting and knew the military medical evaluation system the way a locksmith knows a lock. Not from outside the door, but from inside the mechanism. Garrett called a man named Phil Torres, who had connections at the Department of Defense and a temper specifically calibrated for bureaucratic obstruction. Phil called 2 men at once because Phil operated at a level of efficiency that other people found exhausting, and he did not care. Within 3 weeks of Raymond's first phone call, there were 7 men involved who had not known Marcus Webb a month before. Within 5 weeks, there were 12. None of them had been asked to be there. None of them were doing it for credit. They were doing it because Raymond Okafor had said, on a phone call with a man he had bled alongside, "There's a kid who got smirked at and deserved better." And that sentence, in the vocabulary of the men who heard it, was not a small sentence. It was the kind of sentence that organizes action. Marcus knew about Raymond. He did not yet know about the other 11. He was still running in the park every morning, still stretching the knee every night, still carrying the weight of the 2 rejections, and the smirk in the quiet way that he carried most things, folded in, present, part of the inventory. He had no idea that 11 men who had survived things most people can't pronounce were spending their evenings on phone calls and emails and document reviews, all pointed in his direction. He found out on a Wednesday. Raymond told him on the bench, in the park, in a matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a logistical development. He said there were some people who wanted to help. He said they were serious people. He said they had already started. Marcus looked at the park for a while. The loose dog was doing its morning circuit. The lights were still broken. He said, "Why?" Raymond thought about it. He said, "Because the smirk was wrong. Because what's right is right. Because some of us spent a long time in rooms where people decided who mattered, and we know what that decision cost the person on the other end of it." He picked up his thermos. "And because you've been out here every morning for 3 months, not making excuses. That means something. That means a lot, actually." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "All right." And the work began. The 12 men did not operate the way people in movies operate when they're building towards something important. There was no war room. No dramatic map on a wall with pins in it. No one stood in front of a whiteboard and delivered a speech. What there was mostly was email threads with too many reply alls and a group phone call every Thursday at 7 p.m. that ran long, because Phil Torres had strong opinions about procedural documentation and was not shy about them. Garrett Hooks ran the medical evaluation portion from his home office in Atlanta, surrounded by 3 monitors and a filing system that was either a masterpiece of organization or a cry for help, depending on who you asked. He had spent 4 years after leaving the teams working as a consultant for a firm that advised veterans on medical discharge appeals. He had sat across the table from the kind of bureaucratic resistance that expresses itself in delays and fine print and requests for additional documentation that arrived 2 days before the deadline for that documentation. He had learned the architecture of that resistance the way you learn something you've had to fight through repeatedly, not from a textbook, but from the bruises. Marcus Webb's case was, in Garrett's assessment, not complicated. The injury was documented. The recovery was documented. The physical therapy clearance was real and from a licensed practitioner and said what it said. The knee was functional. The question was not whether Marcus could physically serve. The question was whether the right person reading the right documentation in the right sequence would evaluate it fairly. That last part was the work. Garrett made calls. He knew people in the military medical evaluation system who were still in it, people who had been in it and left for private practice, people who had opinions about how evaluation standards were applied inconsistently, depending on circumstances that had nothing to do with the medical facts. He was careful. He was not asking for favors. He was asking for process, for Marcus's file to be reviewed by someone who would look at what was actually in it. Phil Torres handled the advocacy coordination. Phil had a gift for institutional navigation that he described, without irony, as his least impressive skill. He was 47, had left the teams after his second knee surgery and before his third, and had spent the subsequent years working in veterans policy at a level that most people who interact with government policy never see. Not the public-facing level where the speeches are made, but the procedural level where the actual decisions get shaped. He knew which forms mattered and which forms were formalities. He knew which offices returned calls and which offices did not return calls and which offices returned calls if you called the right person there instead of the main line. What Phil identified early was that Marcus's situation had been handled by a recruiter who had applied discretionary judgment in a way that was technically within protocol and practically wrong. The protocol existed to allow recruiters to screen out candidates with medical histories that could become liabilities. The recruiter had used it as a shortcut. This was not a firing offense. It was not illegal. It was the kind of thing that happens every day in offices with fluorescent lighting and too much coffee and people who have been doing a job long enough to let their assumptions do the work their attention should be doing. Fixing it required going around the recruiter without going over his head in a way that would create procedural blowback on a Marcus. Phil had done this kind of thing before. He had a phrase for it that he used on the Thursday calls. He called it finding the door that's already open. Every institution has them. They just don't advertise. Frank D. Silva ran the mentorship side. This was in some ways the most important side, though Frank would have pushed back on the word important because Frank distrusted any word that invited comparison. Frank had been working with veterans and young men transitioning into military service for 6 years through a Charleston-based program that he had started after his third deployment with $700 of his own money and a borrowed folding table. The program had grown. The folding table was still in his office. He kept it there on purpose. Frank started meeting with Marcus directly, which was something Marcus had not expected and which altered the shape of his days. Frank was not a soft man, but he was a patient one, and patience in a person who is not soft is a very particular and effective thing. He asked Marcus questions and then waited for the real answers, which were not always the first answers and sometimes not the second ones either. He asked Marcus about the accident. He asked about the knee and what it had cost him the year since, not physically, but in terms of what he had stopped allowing himself to want, because wanting something you might not get is its own kind of injury. Marcus, who did not talk about himself easily, talked. He said that for a long time after the accident, he had operated on a kind of internally negotiated ceiling. He had decided, without deciding, that certain things were for other people now. Not with bitterness, just with the quiet pragmatism of someone managing limited resources. You stop spending energy on doors that look closed and you redirect toward what's open. He had done that. He had built a decent life within the adjusted parameters. The warehouse job was good work, honest work, the kind of work his father respected and that Marcus respected too. But the ceiling was still there. He could feel it when he lay awake. The military hadn't been a spontaneous idea. It had been 2 years of talking himself back up to believing the door was worth trying. The smirk had been confirmation of what part of him had feared, that the ceiling he had installed was accurate, that the adjusted parameters were real, that some things really were for other people now. Frank listened to all of this and then said one thing. He said, ceilings aren't structural. They're just drywall. You can walk through drywall if you know where you're going. Marcus thought about that for a long time afterward. The Thursday calls continued. The group had grown to 12 because Raymond had mentioned the situation to a man named Calvin Bright, who was a retired SEAL and now a high school athletic director in Columbia, and Calvin had mentioned it to 2 others before Raymond could ask him to hold off. The 12 included 2 men Marcus's age who had completed their service and were now in civilian careers, and they were perhaps the most useful voices on the calls because they could speak to what Marcus would actually face, not the institutional process which Garrett and Phil had covered, but the daily reality of being a young man with a non-standard history in a system built for standard histories. One of them, a man named Devontae Simmons, who had lost 2 fingers on his right hand in training and had served anyway through a reclassification process, said something on the 4th Thursday call that became a kind of reference point for the group. He said, "The point is not to make the system pretend there's no obstacle. The point is to make the system look at the obstacle honestly and decide whether it's actually a disqualifier or whether somebody just decided it was because deciding was easier than evaluating." Nobody had anything to add to that for a moment. Then Phil said, "That's the cleanest summary of what we're doing that I have heard in 4 weeks of calls." And the call continued. Marcus did not attend the Thursday calls. He had been told about the group, told about the general shape of what they were doing, but the specific workings of it were kept separate from him deliberately. Frank had explained the reasoning. He said that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer a person who has been dismissed is not a play-by-play of how you're correcting it, but a steady forward motion in their own life so that when the opportunity arrives, they are ready to meet it rather than waiting for it. Frank said, "We don't want you watching. We want you working." So Marcus worked. He worked at the warehouse during the days. He ran in the mornings, the knees solid, the times improving. He met with Frank twice a week. He studied. On Frank's recommendation, he had enrolled in a community college course in logistics and supply chain management, not because it was required, but because it was useful and because useful things were worth doing in the space where waiting lived. He was in class on a Thursday evening, learning about freight documentation, when Garrett made the call that opened the door. The call was to a senior medical officer at the Regional Military Entrance Processing Station, a man named Colonel David Herrera, who had served with someone Garrett had served with, 2 degrees of connection, the kind that in civilian life means nothing and in veteran life means you get the call returned. Garrett did not ask Herrera to do anything irregular. He asked him to personally review the documentation in Marcus Webb's case before a final evaluation determination was made. He explained what the documentation contained. He explained what the documentation said about functional recovery. He said, "This is a complete file. I'm asking for it to get a complete reading." Herrera said he would look at it. 3 days later, Herrera called back. He said the documentation was thorough and that the functional recovery indicators were within standard. He said the initial assessment had been conducted without a full review of the physical therapy records, which were present in the file, but had apparently not been examined. He said this was an oversight. He did not say who was responsible for the oversight. He said he was authorizing a full medical reevaluation. Garrett hung up the phone and sent one message to the Thursday call group. It said, "Doors open." Phil forwarded it to Raymond. Raymond walked to the park the next morning and sat on his bench and waited. He had his thermos. The dog was doing its circuit. The lights were still broken. Marcus came around the far bend of the path, right knee holding, pace steady. Raymond said, "There's news." Marcus stopped. He looked at Raymond. Raymond told him about the reevaluation. He told him it was scheduled. He told him it was real. He told him what Garrett had said about the documentation review and what Herrera had said about the oversight. Marcus stood there in the morning park with his hands on his knees, not from the running, just from the weight of what he was hearing, the physical response of a person receiving something they had been managing the absence of for a very long time. He said, "All of them did this? All 12. Raymond said, "All 12. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The loose dog completed its circuit and sat down near the bench with the self-satisfied air of a dog who has accomplished its morning goals. Marcus said, "I don't know how to. I don't have a word for what that is." Raymond said, "You don't need a word. You just need to show up for the evaluation like you've been showing up for every morning in this park. The rest is already done." Marcus nodded. He stretched the knee. He looked at the broken lights. "Okay," he said. Raymond unscrewed his thermos. The evaluation was in 6 days. Those 6 days were, by Marcus's own later account, the strangest 6 days of his adult life. Not because anything dramatic happened in them. Because nothing did. The work had been done by others. The door had been opened by others. All that was required of Marcus Webb for 6 days was to continue being Marcus Webb. To run in the morning, work at the warehouse, attend his class, stretch his knee, sleep when he could, eat when he remembered to, and trust that the thing assembled in his direction by men he barely knew would hold its shape until he arrived at the moment it was built for. Trust is not a passive thing. For Marcus, who had learned to manage his own expectations as a survival strategy, trust was in fact the most demanding thing asked of him in those 6 days. It required him to keep his hands off the ceiling he had built, to not renegotiate downward, to hold, without flinching, the possibility that something was going to go well. He held it. He showed up on the morning of the evaluation in clean clothes with complete documentation and a knee that had run 4 miles at 5:47 in the morning without complaint. The evaluating physician was a man named Dr. Linda Park, a civilian contractor who did military entrance medical assessments and had a manner that was brisk without being unkind and precise in the way of someone who does a thing correctly because correctness is what the thing requires. She reviewed Marcus's file before he sat down. She asked him to walk, to flex, to rotate. She had him do a squat and hold it. She checked the PT clearance documentation with the attention of someone who had been asked to look at it closely because she had been. The evaluation took 40 minutes. Dr. Park wrote her assessment while Marcus waited in a hallway on a plastic chair, watching people move past in uniform and thinking about nothing in particular, which was the closest to peace he had access to that morning. She came out and found him in the hall. She said, "Your knee is functional and within standard parameters for enlistment. There are no medical disqualifiers in your file." She said it the way doctors say things, factually, without drama, with the steady professionalism of someone who has delivered much harder news and much better news and has calibrated her delivery accordingly. Marcus said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome. Good luck." He sat in the plastic chair for another moment after she left. Then he took out his phone and called Raymond. Raymond answered on the second ring. Marcus said, "It's clear." Raymond said, "Good." There was a pause. Raymond said, "How do you feel?" Marcus thought about it. "Like I've been running uphill for a year, and I just found out the hill ends," he said. Raymond made a sound that was close to a laugh, but quieter than one. "It doesn't end," he said. "It changes grade. But that's enough for now." The enlistment process that followed was not romantic. It was paperwork. It was waiting rooms. It was 3 separate instances of being asked to provide documentation that was already in the file, which Marcus provided without comment, because Phil Torres had told him very specifically that the correct response to bureaucratic redundancy is compliance without friction, that friction costs more than it gains, and that getting what you came for is more important than being right about what should have already been sufficient. Marcus had written that down. He kept it in a note on his phone. He looked at it twice. He was formally enlisted into the United States Marine Corps on a Thursday morning in November, 4 months after the medical reevaluation, and 11 months after the morning he had walked into that recruiting office and been handed a pamphlet and a smirk. The enlisting officer was not the same man who had been at the desk that first morning. Marcus had not expected him to be. He had also not expected to feel anything about that, and he mostly didn't except for one moment, brief, private, over before it began, when he was signing the final form, and he thought about that Tuesday in August, and the sound from the corner of the room, and the way the afternoon had felt in his car afterward, and then he signed his name in the clean way of someone putting something behind them, not with drama, just with intention. He called his parents that evening. His mother cried. His father said, "Good," and then asked if he had eaten, which was how his father expressed most things that mattered to him. He called Raymond. Raymond said, "The Thursday group will want to hear." Marcus said he didn't know what to say to them. Raymond said, "Tell them what you told me." About the hill. The Thursday call that week was different in tone from the ones Marcus had been told about, but not attended. There were still 12 men on it, but the texture was different, lighter, the specific lightness of people who have done a hard thing and are now on the other side of it. Phil Torres, whom Marcus was introduced to by voice for the first time, said 3 sentences, and then said he had another call, which was how Phil Torres expressed emotion. Devontae Simmons said, "You came through correct," which was the highest form of praise available in his vocabulary. Frank D. Silva didn't say much. He didn't need to. Marcus was on the call for 40 minutes. He thanked them. He told them about the hill. There was a silence on the line that wasn't empty. Calvin Bright spoke into it. He said, "You know what this was, right? This wasn't charity. This was 12 people who watched someone do the work and decided the only obstruction between him and where he was going was a bad moment in a fluorescent room. We removed the bad moment. You did the rest." Marcus said, "That's a generous framing." Calvin said, "It's accurate framing. Generous would be if we'd done it for someone who hadn't shown up every morning for a year in the dark." There was nothing to say to that either. Boot camp began in January. Marcus Webb arrived at Parris Island in South Carolina in the coldest week the island had produced in 6 years, which felt appropriate to him in a way he didn't try to explain to anyone. The cold had a sharpening quality. The knee held through the first week, the second the month. He ran when required. He ran when not required. He slept in the limited way of people who are spending their physical resources at full rate. And he ate with the focused purposefulness of someone fueling a machine they have invested in. He was not the fastest recruit in his unit. He was not the strongest. He was, by his own account, somewhere in the solid middle, the kind of solid that attracts less attention than excellence or struggle, but accumulates into something over time. His drill instructor was a man named Staff Sergeant Elliot Reeves, who had 17 years in the Corps, and a voice that appeared to originate somewhere in the chest cavity rather than the throat, and who communicated his evaluations of recruits in very short sentences that contained the full weight of his opinion. He told Marcus, after the 3rd week, that his form under fatigue was good. That was it. Marcus treated it like a medal. He did not talk about Raymond or the 12 men. Not because he was hiding it, but because what they had done was not the story he was telling here. The story he was telling here was the one he was writing with his body every morning. The other story, the 11 months, the network, the Thursday calls, the door that Garrett opened, the ceiling that Frank told him to walk through. That story belonged to a different space. A private space. The kind you carry without announcing. The knee became a non-story. That was the most important thing about it. That after enough time and enough miles, it stopped being a character in a narrative and became just a body part that functioned as required. Marcus never forgot about it. He tended it with the same nightly care he had maintained since the accident. But the anxiety that had lived around it, the constant background calculation of what it might cost him, that quieted. It quieted because the thing he had feared it would prevent him from achieving was now being achieved day by day, morning by morning, one qualification at a time. He graduated from boot camp in April. Raymond was there. He had driven 5 hours from Beaufort alone without being asked, and stood in the crowd of families in his good jacket with his cane decorated in brass tacks. And he watched Marcus Webb march across the graduation field with the same steadiness he had watched him run across the park. The right side carrying its history, the pace reliable, the whole person present and accounted for. Marcus saw him in the crowd. He had not known he would be there. For a moment, the composure required of him in that formation was the hardest thing he had been asked to do in 4 months of genuinely hard things. He held it. Afterward, in the crowd of families and new Marines and the particular chaos of joyful reunions, Marcus found Raymond near the edge of the field. His mother had already found him. His father had already gripped his shoulder and said good twice in rapid succession, which was a speech. His friends from home had been loud in the way that people who love you are loud when they're proud of you and have no formal protocol for expressing it. Raymond stood slightly apart from all of it. He shook Marcus's hand and then kept holding it for a moment in the way of a man who has something to say and is choosing the economy of the gesture over the complication of words. He said, "You looked right out there." Marcus said, "You drove 5 hours." Raymond said, 5.5. There was construction. They stood there for a moment. Marcus said, "What do I do with this? All of it. What happened? What's the right thing to do with it?" Raymond looked across the field. New Marines were having their photographs taken. Families were crying in the several different ways that families cry at graduations. Relief, pride, fear about what comes next. All of it folded together into the specific emotion of loving someone who is walking toward something large. Raymond said, "You find the next person. The one who's sitting in their car in a parking lot after a bad morning. The one who's doing the work in the dark where nobody sees it. And you do what was done for you." He picked up his cane. "That's how it works. That's how it has always worked." Marcus nodded. Raymond said, "Don't make it bigger than it is. It doesn't need to be big. It just needs to happen." He left before Marcus could say anything else, which was the Raymond Okafor way of conducting exits, clean, without ceremony, the door closing quietly on what needed to be finished. Marcus stood on the Paris Island graduation field with his mother's arm around his waist and his father's hand on his shoulder, and the spring South Carolina sun doing the thing it does in April, which is to be warm enough to feel like a beginning. And he thought about 12 men on a Thursday call, and a park with broken lights, and a dog who had shown up every morning without being asked, and a cane with brass tacks in a pattern that meant something that had never been explained. He thought about the smirk in the fluorescent room. He had spent almost a year in conversation with that smirk, not obsessing over it. He was not built for obsession, but carrying it the way you carry a stone in your shoe, aware of it with every step, not always painfully, but always present. The awareness of being dismissed by someone who hadn't read his file, hadn't looked at his documentation, hadn't done anything but absorb his limp and make a quick calculation and then share that calculation with a colleague in a quiet voice that was just loud enough. Standing in the April sun, he did the thing he had needed to do with it for 11 months. He let go, not because it had been wrong. It had been wrong, not because it didn't matter. It had mattered a great deal. He let it go because carrying it further was not useful, and Marcus Webb was, at his core, a useful person. He directed energy toward things that could be changed and away from things that were behind him. The smirk was behind him. The recruiting office, the pamphlet, the fluorescent light, the drive home behind him. What was in front of him was large and unmapped and required everything he had. He turned his attention to it. The months that followed built on each other the way months do when a person is in the right place. Not without difficulty, not without cost, but with the accumulating sense of a person discovering what they contain. Advanced training, the knee held, the formation of competencies that had previously been abstract, discipline, unit cohesion, operational execution under conditions designed to exceed what a person thought they could sustain. Marcus exceeded what he thought he could sustain regularly, which is the machine of growth whether you're comfortable with it or not. He was not the loudest person in any room. He was still the person who walked in as if still deciding whether rooms were the right place for him, but the texture of that had changed. The uncertainty had compressed. He had walked through enough rooms and found enough of himself on the other side that the entering was easier, and the self that entered was more fully inhabited. He made friends. He made them the way quiet people make friends, slowly, through reliability, through the trust that is only built by showing up the same way repeatedly until the people around you understand that the consistency is the thing and not a performance of it. He called his parents every week. He called Frank D. Silva twice. He emailed Garrett Hooks a photo from his first full field exercise, no caption, which Garrett forwarded to the Thursday call group, which Phil Torres responded to with a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. Raymond heard about it from Frank and considered that sufficient. 2 years after boot camp, Marcus Webb was stationed at Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, working in logistics. The supply chain management coursework from the community college had not been accidental. He was good at logistics. He had an instinct for systems, for the way things connect, and what happens when a connection fails, for the difference between a process that is theoretical and a process that has to function under real conditions with real time and real consequences. He was the kind of person that organizations build around quietly, without ceremony, because the value is in the doing rather than the announcing. He still ran in the mornings. The knee had become fully and finally just a knee. He wrote to Raymond on the 2-year anniversary of the graduation, which was not a thing he had planned to do, but did because the morning called for it. He wrote that he had found someone. He described the situation in general terms. A young man from the base community, mid-20s, dealing with a medical assessment process that was moving slowly. The young man had mentioned, without drama, that he was starting to feel like the process was telling him something about himself rather than about the paperwork. Marcus wrote, "I told him paperwork isn't a verdict. I told him to keep running." Raymond wrote back the next morning. He said, "Good." He said, "That's how it works." He said, "Call Frank. He knows people." Marcus called Frank. The work continued. There is no version of this story that ends with a speech or a moment on a stage or a photograph that gets shared widely with a caption that reduces 11 months of quiet work to something that fits above a fold. Real things rarely end that way. They end with one person sitting in a park on a bench with a thermos and another person coming around the far bend of a path, and the morning accumulating around them the way mornings do when nothing needs to be said because what needed to be done has been done, and what needs to come next will announce itself when it arrives. Raymond Okafor still goes to the park. The lights are still broken. The dog is still there. Some things persist because they are right. Not loudly right, not dramatically right. Just right in the quiet and functional way of things that continue because the world is better with them in it, and the people involved have decided, without announcement, to continue being the kind of people who show up. That is the whole story. That is enough of story.